If you've had COVID-19, you'll know the virus isn't the same for everybody. Some patients experience a mild illness and others a fight for their lives. Now using an app to collect data, scientists here at King's College London say that they've identified 6 different types of COVID-19 symptoms. Symptoms can be far more wide-ranging than doctors first thought. With the first type of symptoms, patients experience headache, loss of smell, muscle pains, sore throat, cough and chest pains. With the second type, they also have a fever, as well as hoarseness and a loss of appetite. The third type does not include a cough, but sufferers do have diarrhoea. Those are the milder sets of symptoms, and according to this research, also the least likely on their own to result in patients needing breathing support or serious medical attention. But then come 3 sets of severe symptoms, where patients are most likely to be hospitalised. Level 1 leads to flu-like symptoms and hoarseness with added fatigue. With Level 2, patients experience confusion and muscle pain. And finally, Level 3, serious abdominal and respiratory symptoms, including shortness of breath and abdominal pain. Grouping the symptoms has enabled scientists to build an AI prediction tool that could alert physicians when a patient might require hospital care based on their earliest symptoms.
We can say, oh, actually, this person, we should potentially bring him or her to hospital a bit earlier, or no, we will wait a bit more, but we have a trigger system that tells us, oh, actually, now we need to act a bit earlier.
The early warning system could help physicians work out where hospital beds will be most needed, as states like Florida, Texas and Arizona grapple with a surge of new cases.
This is by far the most gold standard that we could ever have in regards to critical care resources and allocation in the time of the pandemic. Being able to predict who will not do well is huge. It's so important to have.
The findings of the UK study have yet to be peer-reviewed, but as countries face a second wave, it could be technology that's leveraged for a response that's smarter, faster and saves more lives. Helena Humphrey, NBC News, London.
Hey NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.